Tonight, we settle in southern Africa, among wide skies and open grasslands, where stone walls still hold their shape. Our theme is quiet change, how a great place can grow, endure, and then soften into silence, slowly, and without a single dramatic ending. If you imagine arriving at Great Zimbabwe in the calm of early evening, you do not need to picture a sudden scene or a single moment. You can simply picture space. Stone set upon stone, fitted carefully without mortar, forming curving walls that guide the eye in a patient way. And above those walls, the steady movement of air, wind passing over grass, over rock, and over time. Great Zimbabwe is a real place, in what is now Zimbabwe, and the ruins that remain are among the most remarkable stone structures of pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. The site is best known for its large enclosures and carefully built walls, worked from local granite. Even when you speak of it softly, and without grand claims, the workmanship still suggests planning, skill, and sustained effort over many years. At this point in the story, it helps to hold one simple idea. In ancient history, silence does not always mean disaster. Sometimes it means movement. Sometimes it means a change in where people choose to live, trade, and gather. And sometimes it means that a place, once central, becomes less used over time, not because it was destroyed, but because life slowly recenters elsewhere. Because Great Zimbabwe left few written records that we can confidently treat as direct local testimony, much of what we know comes from archaeology. Archaeology, in simple terms, is the careful study of material traces, walls, pottery, floors, tools, and the thin layers of soil that build up over long periods. Those layers matter. They can tell us what came earlier and what came later, even when no one wrote a clear timeline for us. When historians and archaeologists speak about Great Zimbabwe, they are often speaking through patterns. They look at the arrangement of stone enclosures. They look at the wear of pathways. They study fragments of pottery, which can change in style over generations. They consider where evidence of cooking and craftwork appears, and where it fades. And then, with care, they attempt to describe a society not as a dramatic story, but as a living world with routines and decisions. So, rather than begin with a bold claim, we begin with a gentle one. Great Zimbabwe was an important center in its region, and the scale of its stone architecture suggests coordinated work and social organization. Evidence suggests that it was connected to wider networks of exchange, and that people gathered here over a significant span of time. But the record is incomplete, and responsible history moves slowly when certainty is not available. It is also worth noticing how easily the modern mind wants a single cause and a single ending. We often want to ask, what happened, as if history were one event. For Great Zimbabwe, scholars generally caution against that impulse. Many researchers describe change here as gradual, shaped by multiple pressures and shifting opportunities. And because evidence comes in fragments, scholars sometimes disagree on emphasis: how much climate mattered, how trade routes shifted, how resources were managed, and how leadership may have changed. In this documentary, we will treat those possibilities gently, without forcing them into one simple answer. We will move through a calm sequence: the setting, the rise of a center, the daily lives that sustained it, the systems that organized it, and then the slow pressures that may have encouraged people to build differently, live differently, and eventually spend less time within these walls. For now, we stay with the present moment, the stones as they are. The walls do not tell us everything, but they do tell us something. They tell us that knowledge was carried in hands and practice. They tell us that communities could organize labor and maintain shared projects. They tell us that the past was not empty. It was inhabited, repeated, and shaped by ordinary days. As the wind moves steadily across the site, it can serve as a quiet guide for the listener. Wind does not rush. It passes, it returns, it passes again. In the same way, the history we are about to explore is not a sharp line. It is a long, slow current, made of seasons, work, and decisions that accumulate until the shape of a place changes. And when we speak about the night the city went silent, we should keep our language careful. Great Zimbabwe was not a city in the modern sense of paved streets and written administration we can directly read. But it was a substantial center, large enough, organized enough, and enduring enough that its quieting deserves attention. The phrase is a metaphor for gradual change, not an invitation to imagine a single night of abandonment. So we begin where the evidence begins, with the landscape, with the stone, and with the method. Archaeology gives us the most direct path into this story, supported by scholarly interpretation and, at times, careful comparison with other regional histories. Where the ground is firm, we will walk steadily. Where the ground is uncertain, we will slow down, and say so. If you keep only one thought close, let it be this: Great Zimbabwe changed over time in ways that were likely ordinary to those living through them. A household chooses a slightly different routine. A community makes a small shift in where it gathers. Trade patterns adapt. Resources are managed. And slowly, without needing fire or drama, the center of gravity moves. The stones remain, and the wind remains, and the quiet is not emptiness. It is simply time, continuing. As the wind stays constant, we can step back to the earlier centuries and the first growth of this place. At this point in the story, we step back from the finished stone walls and return to an earlier, quieter landscape. We are still in the region of Great Zimbabwe, moving slowly through the long process by which a local network can become a lasting center. In the beginning, the most important parts of history are often the least dramatic. A good place to live is chosen for simple reasons. Water is within reach. Grazing land stretches out nearby. Fields can be tended without traveling too far. And paths, sometimes small at first, link one community to another, carrying news, goods, and familiar routines. Evidence suggests that long before Great Zimbabwe became known for stone architecture, the wider region supported settled communities with mixed livelihoods. People could raise animals, grow crops, and make the tools and containers needed for daily life. These are not bold statements, because they rest on ordinary traces, fragments of pottery, ash from hearths, animal bones, and the kinds of objects that tend to appear wherever people cook, store food, and work. Over time, some places begin to matter a little more than others. Not because they are chosen by fate, but because geography offers small advantages that accumulate. A location that sits near dependable water, or near good pasture, or along routes that connect different environments can gradually draw people in. When historians speak carefully about hubs, they often mean this quiet process, small choices repeated over generations until a pattern becomes visible. Archaeology is the main guide here, and it is a patient one. Archaeologists do not only look at what is standing above ground. They also look at what lies beneath, in layers. Stratigraphy, in simple terms, is the study of those layers of soil and remains, stacked over time, which can help researchers understand what came earlier and what came later. It is one of the ways the past can be placed into a sequence, even without written dates. At Great Zimbabwe, and in surrounding sites, the layering of remains can suggest changes in settlement and activity over long periods. But it is important to speak gently about timing. The record is incomplete, and dating can vary depending on where one excavates and which materials are preserved. Scholars disagree on exact sequences in some areas, and responsible history makes room for that disagreement without turning it into drama. As communities grow and connect, another quiet change can appear: coordination. A center, in the simplest sense, is a place where people organize work together, sometimes for storage, sometimes for ritual, sometimes for trade, and sometimes simply because living close brings stability. Evidence suggests that at some stage, labor and planning at Great Zimbabwe became organized enough to support large construction projects. Stone architecture is one of the clearest signs of that coordination, though it should be treated with care. The walls are not only piles of rock. They are shaped, fitted, and maintained, which implies trained knowledge and repeated practice. Building at that scale usually requires more than individual households working alone. It suggests cooperation, whether directed by leaders, guided by custom, or supported by shared expectations. This is also where we can speak, softly and cautiously, about early social layering. In any community that undertakes large projects, roles begin to differentiate. Some people may focus more on herding. Others may be skilled in craft production, such as pottery or metalwork. Others may organize labor, manage storage, or oversee exchange. Evidence suggests these roles existed in some form, because specialized objects and patterned spaces tend to appear in the archaeological record when skills and responsibilities are not evenly distributed. Still, the record does not give us a neat list of titles or a clear map of ranks. There are no locally produced administrative texts that simply tell us who ruled, how decisions were made, or how leadership was passed on. Much of what scholars propose comes from careful interpretation of spaces, materials, and patterns, useful, but not complete. So we keep our language steady. It is possible that leadership and social differentiation grew alongside the site, and archaeology provides hints rather than certainties. Environmental and scientific evidence can add another quiet layer to this picture. Studies of soils, vegetation change, and broader climate patterns can sometimes help historians think about why certain regions supported growth at particular times. But here, too, the picture is not always precise. Climate varies locally, evidence is uneven, and scholars debate how directly broad environmental signals translate into daily decisions. It is often safest to say that environment forms the background conditions, while human choices shape the foreground. At this point in the story, it helps to remember that early growth is usually gradual. A center does not have to appear all at once. It can gather strength in small increments, more households nearby, more exchange along familiar routes, more people who return season after season. And then, over time, the built environment begins to reflect that stability, taking a more permanent form. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. A pot is made and used until it breaks, then replaced. A herd is moved with the seasons. Grain is stored, shared, and carried. Small paths become well-worn. And gradually, the patterns that seem private and domestic begin to support something larger. So when we imagine Great Zimbabwe becoming a stone-built center, we do not need a sudden turning point. We can picture a long sequence of ordinary decisions that, together, create a place worth building for, returning to, and sustaining. Evidence suggests that this is how many enduring centers come to be, not by a single event, but by steady accumulation. Now that we have a gentle sense of how a regional community could grow into a lasting center, we can move closer to the quiet center of the story. At this point in the story, we are listening for ordinary life around Great Zimbabwe, daily routines that archaeology can hint at, even when personal voices are not preserved. When historians try to understand daily life in a place like Great Zimbabwe, they begin with what is most reliable. They begin with patterns in the ground. They look for the marks of repeated activity, where fires were lit, where food was prepared, where people walked often enough to shape space into habit. Archaeology, in this setting, does not hand us a diary. It offers a softer kind of knowledge. Evidence suggests that households were organized around practical needs: shelter, cooking, storage, work, and rest. Those needs are timeless, and even when names are lost, the traces of those needs can remain. In and around major centers, archaeologists often identify domestic areas through the presence of hearths, ash, broken pottery, and the small debris that accumulates when people live in one place for a long time. A hearth, in simple terms, is a place where fire was kept and used repeatedly, for warmth, for cooking, and for the steady work of daily meals. When these hearths appear again and again across a landscape, they can suggest neighborhoods of lived-in routine, rather than spaces used only for ceremony or display. At this point in the story, it is helpful to move slowly and keep our claims modest. Material remains show patterns, but they rarely reveal personal feelings or the texture of individual relationships. We cannot say with confidence what a person hoped for, or feared, or celebrated on a given evening. The record is incomplete. And yet, we can still approach the everyday rhythm with respect, because daily life leaves behind a consistent signature. Foodways, how people produced, prepared, and stored food, are one of the clearest places where evidence can speak. In a region where herding and farming are both possible, evidence suggests that many households balance these activities in ways suited to season and rainfall. Herding, in simple terms, is the long-term care and movement of animals for milk, meat, hides, and social value. Farming, when conditions allow it, adds grains and other foods that can be stored and carried. Storage matters in calm history because storage makes time feel less sharp. When food can be kept from one season to the next, households and leaders gain a kind of stability. Archaeologists may infer storage through certain kinds of containers, through the organization of domestic space, and through the repeated evidence of food preparation and consumption. But here, too, we speak carefully. We can often see that storage existed in some form, yet the exact scale and management of it can be difficult to reconstruct. Environmental and scientific evidence can provide a quiet background to these routines. Studies of landscape change, soils, and broader rainfall patterns can help scholars think about seasonal pressures and the constraints that farming and herding would have faced. But climate evidence is not a script. It does not tell us what people decided in any single year. It offers context, an outline of conditions within which daily choices were made. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. In the morning, someone tends a fire. Later, someone checks animals and fences, or walks to fields, or carries water. In the late light, a vessel is cleaned, repaired, or replaced. Nothing about these actions is dramatic, and yet they are the steady work that allows any larger center to endure. Craft production appears in the archaeological record as another quiet indicator of daily life and skill. Pottery, for example, is both practical and revealing. Metalworking, where evidence supports it, suggests another layer of specialized knowledge. The making of metal tools or ornaments usually involves controlled heat, skilled handling, and access to materials. When such traces appear, they can imply networks. Someone gathers resources, someone shapes them, someone uses them, and someone values the finished work enough for the craft to continue. Still, the record may not show how widely such skills were shared, or who held them. Evidence suggests specialization, but it does not always tell us the social story behind it. As we linger on households and crafts, we can also begin to sense how social order might have been expressed quietly. Not through speeches or written laws, but through space. Archaeologists often look at where people lived, and where certain objects appear, to infer differences in status or role. If some areas contain more rare materials, more finely worked objects, or different building patterns, scholars may interpret this as a sign of social layering. But this is an area where interpretation must remain gentle. Scholars disagree on how exactly to map social hierarchy onto space, especially when different excavations emphasize different parts of a site. An object found in one place may have been moved there later. A space used for one purpose in one period may have been used differently in another. The record is incomplete, and conclusions are careful and partial. So rather than force certainty, we can describe what the evidence can reasonably suggest. Great Zimbabwe's built environment includes distinct zones and enclosures. Many scholars interpret this as reflecting some degree of organized space, areas for domestic activity, areas for gathering, and areas that may have been more restricted or symbolically important. Yet the precise meaning of these divisions remains debated, and responsible history keeps that debate in view without turning it into a conflict. At this point in the story, it can help to remember that social order often feels normal to those living within it. Most people do not wake each day thinking about political systems. They wake into routines: work to do, food to prepare, tools to mend, people to meet, obligations to keep. And over time, those routines support broader structures of authority and exchange, whether or not the individuals involved describe them in abstract terms. Now, as promised, we place a brief orientation recap here, something soft and steady for listeners who may be drifting. We are in the region of Great Zimbabwe, in the centuries when it functioned as a significant center, known today through stone architecture and the material traces of everyday life. So far, we have moved from the landscape and evidence, to early growth, and now into households, food, craft, and the quiet patterns that suggest a lived society. And we continue, calmly. When you picture daily life here, the safest image is not a specific scene, but a stable rhythm. Cooking fires lit and tended. Pottery handled and replaced. Herds guided across familiar ground. Seasonal work moving at a human pace. These are the kinds of patterns archaeology can approach with the most confidence, because they leave repeated traces across time. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. It is in that steady rhythm that a center becomes more than walls. It becomes a place people return to, rely on, and organize around. From the household level, we can slowly widen the view to how power and exchange may have been organized. At this point in the story, we widen our view from households and routines to the gentle structures that help a center hold together. We remain at Great Zimbabwe, letting the evidence guide us toward what authority and exchange may have looked like, without forcing certainty where the record is quiet. When we speak about political systems in a place without local written administration, we begin with a simple rule: we describe what can be inferred, and we name what cannot be known. Great Zimbabwe's stone walls do not tell us titles, councils, or succession rules. The record is incomplete. And yet, evidence suggests that organization existed, because large-scale building, long-term maintenance, and coordinated space usually require shared direction. Archaeologists often look at architecture as a kind of footprint of social choice. Some spaces feel open and communal. Others feel more controlled, more separated, or more carefully bounded. When a landscape is divided in structured ways, scholars sometimes interpret this as a sign that certain activities, gatherings, or people were guided into particular places. It may point toward authority, not necessarily in a modern governmental sense, but in a practical sense of who could organize labor and manage important spaces. Authority, in this calm historical sense, does not have to be loud. It can be steady. It can live in expectations that people follow because they have followed them for a long time. It can appear in the ability to gather workers for building projects, to store resources, and to coordinate exchange with surrounding communities. Evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe functioned as a focal point within a wider region, and focal points usually rest on agreements, spoken, customary, and repeated. Here it can help to keep our language gentle. We are not describing a modern state with written laws we can quote. We are describing a pre-modern system that scholars reconstruct from material traces and comparisons with other societies where similar patterns appear. Comparative history, used carefully, can suggest that when a center grows large and stable, leadership structures often emerge to manage labor, settle disputes, and oversee resources. But scholars disagree on the exact shape those structures took at Great Zimbabwe. If we turn from authority to exchange, we find another quiet pathway into the past. An economy, in a pre-modern context, is not only money and markets. It is the steady movement of goods, labor, and skills, food produced and stored, tools made and traded, materials carried along routes that people learn and trust. In simple terms, an ancient economy is the way people meet needs through work and exchange, often shaped by season, distance, and relationships. Evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe participated in regional networks, connections between communities who produce different things in different environments. One area may have had better grazing. Another may have had different soils for farming. Another may have had access to particular minerals or craft skills. Over time, these differences encourage exchange, not as a grand plan, but as a practical habit. There is also careful scholarly discussion of longer-distance connections, reaching outward beyond the immediate region. Some material finds, interpreted cautiously, can suggest links to broader Indian Ocean trade networks in certain periods. Still, it is important to keep our tone steady here. The presence of traded items does not mean that every household was involved, or that trade was constant. It suggests contact, not a full picture. The record is incomplete, and archaeologists often debate how trade was organized and who controlled it. When exchange becomes steady, questions of collection and distribution often follow. This is where we can introduce a simple definition, gently. Tribute, in plain language, is goods or labor given to leaders or institutions, sometimes as a duty, sometimes as a customary offering, especially when evidence suggests that resources were gathered and managed in a central place. At Great Zimbabwe, scholars may discuss tribute-like systems as one possible explanation for how labor and wealth could be coordinated. But the exact mechanisms are not directly readable from the ruins, and models vary. Wealth signals are another area where archaeology can speak, quietly, through patterns rather than proclamations. If certain materials appear more often in some areas than others, scholars may interpret this as uneven access, differences in status, role, or connection. If some spaces show signs of greater investment, greater separation, or association with rarer goods, the pattern may suggest leadership households or elite zones. Yet we must be careful. Objects can move. Layers can be disturbed. Interpretations can shift with new excavations. So we return to the calm center of what is most defensible. Great Zimbabwe's scale and organization suggest a society capable of coordination. Its material record suggests exchange across regions, and possibly beyond, though the extent and structure of those networks remain debated. And its built spaces suggest that access and activity may have been shaped by social order, again, in ways we can outline, but not fully name. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. Even the largest systems are made of small actions repeated, a portion of grain set aside, a crafted object carried to a neighbor, a day of labor given to a shared project, a meeting held in a familiar place. Over time, these acts can form the quiet work of governance, without needing dramatic scenes. If you picture this governance in a sleep-friendly way, you can picture it as coordination rather than command. People gathering to build and maintain walls. People agreeing, by custom and practice, on where certain activities belong. People moving goods along routes that are known and trusted. Leadership, whatever its form, would likely have been embedded in these rhythms, not separate from them. And we hold on to uncertainty with respect. We cannot read names from stone. We cannot quote decrees. We can only follow the careful reasoning of archaeology and scholarship, and accept that some parts of this system remain unseen. In calm history, that is not a failure. It is simply the honest shape of the evidence. As this chapter closes, we do not need to push forward quickly. Once systems like these settle into place, authority expressed through coordination, exchange through trusted networks, the archaeological record often shows its clearest signs of stability. And that steady middle period is where we will go next. Once systems settle into place, we can look. At this point in the story, we rest in the long middle years, when Great Zimbabwe appears in the evidence as steady, organized, and enduring. This is not a dramatic high point, but a sustained season of continuity, held together by routines, planning, and the quiet maintenance of a living center. When historians use the word peak, they often mean something practical rather than celebratory. They mean a period when signs of occupation and organization are strong in the archaeological record, when building continues, when spaces are maintained, and when everyday activity leaves a steady trail of traces. For Great Zimbabwe, many scholars describe such a period, though the exact timing and the details can vary across different excavated areas. It helps to think of peak as a long, calm middle. Walls do not build themselves, and they do not remain standing without attention. Evidence suggests that large stone structures were not only constructed, but cared for, kept in use, repaired where needed, and integrated into the rhythms of life. Maintenance is a quiet kind of proof, because it implies that a place remained meaningful enough for people to keep returning to it. At this point in the story, we can also speak gently about building phases. Archaeologists often notice that a major site does not grow in one single moment. It develops in stages, with additions, adjustments, and changes in how certain spaces are used. These stages, taken together, form what scholars call a chronology. A chronology, in simple terms, is the ordering of events and phases over time, often built from multiple dating methods and from the layering of remains in the ground. Chronology matters because it slows the story down in a helpful way. It reminds us that continuity is made of many small steps. A wall line extends. A pathway becomes more worn. A domestic area shifts. Certain styles of pottery appear more often, then gradually change. And when we look at these signs together, evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe held a stable role over a considerable period, even as details evolved quietly. Continuity can also appear in craft and settlement patterns. When a center is stable, everyday production often becomes predictable: pottery made and used, metal worked where the knowledge exists, tools repaired, containers replaced. Archaeologists do not usually claim that craft was uniform or unchanging. Instead, they look for the steady presence of activity across time, signs that a living community continued to operate, rather than a place being used only briefly or sporadically. Regional integration is another quiet indicator scholars discuss. In a stable period, a center often becomes more woven into its surroundings. Goods, people, and information move along familiar routes. Some exchange may be local and frequent, tied to daily needs. Other exchange may be less common, connected to longer-distance links that appear in the material record. Evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe participated in these broader patterns, though scholars continue to debate how centralized those networks were and how evenly their benefits were distributed. It is important, again, to keep our words gentle. Peak can sound like a single summit, but the evidence does not always support that kind of clean image. Different indicators may rise and fall at different times. One part of the site may show strong activity in one period while another area shifts later. Excavation zones are not the whole landscape, and the record is incomplete. So historians often treat peak as a shorthand, a useful way to talk about stability, not a claim of one perfect moment. If we imagine the stability of Great Zimbabwe in a sleep-friendly way, we can picture a center that wakes and sleeps with the seasons. People return to familiar spaces. Work is done in patterns that feel ordinary, repairing what is worn, preparing what is needed, keeping routine steady enough that the larger structure holds. Social coordination, in this sense, is not a dramatic command. It is the ongoing ability to align many small efforts toward shared continuity. Large-scale building, especially, suggests stable planning over time. It implies that people had reasons to invest labor in the future, reasons to believe that the place would remain important. It also implies that there were ways to organize work, whether through leadership, custom, obligation, or shared purpose. The exact form of that organization remains debated, and we should not pretend to read it clearly from stone. Yet the persistence of building and maintenance suggests that coordination was not temporary. Environmental and scientific evidence can help us understand the background conditions of this stable period. The land offers possibilities and constraints: rainfall patterns, soils, grazing capacity, and the resilience of local resources. Researchers sometimes use climate proxies and ecological indicators to think about how conditions may have supported certain forms of settlement and production. But it is rarely precise. Environmental evidence can suggest pressures or opportunities, yet it cannot tell us exactly how any one community responded in a particular year. So we treat the environment as the quiet setting, and human choices as the moving thread. In stable times, choices often look conservative. people tend to keep doing what works. They invest in reliable practices. They reinforce networks that provide predictability. Over time, these choices can make a center feel enduring, even as it slowly adapts. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. In a stable period, that rhythm becomes deep. It settles into the built environment. It becomes visible in repeated traces, the same kinds of domestic activity, the same patterns of movement, the same careful return to maintenance and making. And there is one more soft point to hold. Stability does not mean stillness. A stable center can change in quiet ways without losing its identity. It can absorb new patterns of exchange, adjust its spaces, and shift social arrangements while remaining a focal point. Archaeology often reveals this kind of steady flexibility, continuity with gentle variation. As we close this chapter, we do not need a dramatic turning. We simply allow ourselves to notice what comes next, because even the most stable periods carry small pressures at their edges. The story can move forward without a break, as the steady middle gradually begins to lean toward change. And then, without needing a sudden break, at this point in the story, we move gently from stability into change, without treating change as a sudden break. We remain at Great Zimbabwe, listening for small pressures that can accumulate over years, until the patterns of daily life begin to shift. When historians describe decline in the ancient world, they often mean something quieter than the word suggests. In many cases, decline is not a single event. It is a gradual reorganization, a slow movement of people, work, and attention away from one center and toward another. For Great Zimbabwe, scholars often speak in that careful way, because the evidence does not point to one final scene. Before we go further, here is a short orientation recap, placed here on purpose for sleepy listeners. We began with the stones and the wind, then stepped back to early growth, daily life, and the quiet organization of authority and exchange. Now we are entering the phase of pressures, meaning the overlapping conditions that can make a stable center less practical or less central over time, even without conflict or destruction. One of the most discussed pressures is environmental strain, though it must be stated cautiously. Environmental strain, in simple terms, is the gradual stress placed on land and resources when rainfall varies, soils tire, or grazing and wood supplies are used faster than they can recover. Environmental and scientific evidence, such as studies of soils, vegetation change, and broader climate patterns, can suggest that conditions were not always constant. But the record is incomplete, and scholars disagree on how directly these signals translate into the daily realities of Great Zimbabwe. Still, it is reasonable to say that any long-lived center must live within the limits of its landscape. If rainfall becomes less reliable, farming becomes harder to predict. If pasture is overused, herds must be moved farther, and routines stretch outward. If nearby wood becomes scarce, people must travel more for fuel and building materials. None of this needs to happen all at once. It can happen slowly, in a series of small adjustments that feel ordinary in the moment. Archaeology can sometimes reflect these adjustments in subtle ways. Evidence suggests that patterns of occupation can change. Some areas show less frequent use, some spaces are repurposed, and some activities shift outward to nearby locations. These are not dramatic signs. They are quiet signals, changes in the density of material remains, shifts in where certain objects appear, and differences in how spaces are maintained. Another set of pressures often discussed involves trade and regional balance. Exchange networks are living systems. Routes can change as new centers grow, as preferences shift, or as political relationships realign. If a center's role in exchange becomes less important, the advantages of living close to that center may also soften. Scholars sometimes suggest that shifts in regional trade routes or the rise of alternative centers could have reduced Great Zimbabwe's pull over time. Here, too, we keep our tone careful. The presence or absence of traded goods does not provide a complete map of economic life. It can suggest contact, but not always the strength, frequency, or control of that contact. Archaeological evidence may show changing patterns, but it rarely tells us exactly why the change occurred. So historians often treat trade shifts as one possible factor among several, not as a single master explanation. When we place environmental strain and trade shifts side by side, the story becomes calmer and more realistic. They do not compete. They can overlap. A drier phase can encourage people to spread out. A shift in exchange can make another region feel more promising. Social and political changes, difficult to see directly, can also affect where people choose to live. The record is incomplete, and responsible history allows multiple pressures to remain in view at once. At this point in the story, it can help to picture the built environment as something that reflects lived priorities. When a center is thriving, maintenance is steady. Walls are kept in working order. Pathways remain clear. Spaces remain actively used. When priorities shift, maintenance may become less consistent, not because people suddenly stop caring, but because their time and labor are needed elsewhere. Archaeological signals of change can sometimes include altered building use. A space once used frequently may show fewer traces of activity. A domestic pattern may shift to a different zone. A style of material culture may change, suggesting new connections or new routines. None of these signals are perfect. Layers can be disturbed, evidence can be uneven, and excavation is always partial. But taken together, they can suggest a slow drift rather than a sudden ending. And this is where we return, gently, to the motif that has been with us since the opening. The wind moves across stone, steady and unhurried, even as human patterns shift. The wind does not announce change. It simply passes over what remains. In the same way, the archaeological record often shows change without a single announcement, quiet, cumulative, and real. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. A family chooses to keep more animals farther from the center. A craftsperson follows a new connection for materials. A community finds better water in another place. A leader, or a council, or a network of households, whatever the structure was, adjusts to practical realities. Over time, these choices can soften a center's importance without erasing its legacy. So when we speak of Great Zimbabwe becoming quieter, we do not need to picture collapse. We can picture redistribution. We can picture a landscape where people continue living, working, and organizing, just not in the same concentration, and not always within the same walls. That is often what the evidence suggests, not disappearance, but movement and recentering. As we close this chapter, we keep one calm conclusion. No single cause is universally accepted, and historians often describe interacting factors, environmental conditions, shifting networks, and changing settlement patterns, while acknowledging the limits of what can be known. The story remains steady, and the next step is simply to look more closely at the later phase, when central occupation appears to thin further. With those gradual pressures in view, we can approach the later phase, what the evidence suggests about the final years of central occupation. At this point in the story, we arrive at the later phase, when Great Zimbabwe appears to grow quieter in the evidence. We will stay close to what archaeology can suggest, and we will treat the end not as a single moment, but as a gentle change in how a place is used. When a great center begins to thin in activity, the first thing to remember is that archaeology rarely shows a final scene. It shows patterns. It shows layers where traces become lighter, where certain spaces are used less often, and where maintenance may become less consistent. For Great Zimbabwe, scholars often describe a later phase that looks like this: reduced activity rather than sudden destruction. Archaeologists detect less activity in calm, practical ways. They may find fewer fresh layers of everyday debris, less broken pottery in certain areas, fewer hearth traces, fewer signs of repeated domestic work. They may notice that pathways seem less worn, or that some built spaces show fewer indications of ongoing upkeep. These are subtle signals, and they vary by excavation zone, which is why scholars speak carefully. At this point in the story, it helps to soften a word that is often misunderstood. Abandonment, in simple terms, is not always total or instant. It can be partial, seasonal, or gradual. A place can be used less often before it is used rarely. Some areas can fall quiet while other areas remain active. And people can keep returning for certain purposes, even as they begin living more fully elsewhere. This is one reason historians often prefer the idea of recentering. Recentering means that a region's attention and daily life slowly shift toward other locations, other hills, other valleys, other gathering points that become more practical or more connected. In this view, the story is not about people vanishing. It is about people moving, adapting, and building new routines that fit changing conditions. Comparative history supports this gentle framing. Across many ancient societies, large centers often rise and later soften, not because life ends, but because life redistributes. Trade routes can change. Resources can be managed differently. Leadership can relocate. And once a new center becomes more useful, the older one can become quieter without losing its meaning. For Great Zimbabwe, scholars debate the balance of factors that might have shaped this later phase. Evidence suggests environmental pressures may have played a role for some communities, and shifting networks may have played a role for others. But the timing and the lived experience of departure are difficult to reconstruct. The record is incomplete, and archaeology cannot tell us exactly how individuals felt about leaving, or whether leaving felt like loss, relief, or ordinary change. So we stay with what can be said carefully. Later layers and reduced activity can suggest that the site's central role became less intense over time. Some spaces that once carried daily routines may have been used less often. Certain patterns of material culture may shift, suggesting new connections or new priorities. But these signs do not point to one final day, one final council, or one final decision that we can name. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. In a later phase, those choices might look like small adjustments, a household settling closer to better grazing, a craftsperson following a new source of materials, a community gathering more often in a different place. If those choices are repeated for years, the map of importance changes, quietly and steadily. It is also worth holding a respectful thought about the stones themselves. A stone-built place can outlast the society that first organized it, not because the society disappeared, but because stone does not move the way people do. People shift their centers. They follow water, pasture, and opportunity. They respond to relationships and leadership and the practical needs of daily life. And the walls remain, not as a sign of mystery, but as a sign that human effort once gathered here. In this calm framing, the final years of Great Zimbabwe are not a dramatic fall. They are a thinning. They are the slow quieting of a central place as the region rebalances. Archaeology can show us that quieting as a pattern, even if it cannot give us personal narratives. And scholars, working with care, generally treat that pattern as evidence of transition rather than catastrophe. So when we speak of the city going silent, we can keep the meaning gentle. The site becomes less central. The daily traces become lighter. The rhythm moves elsewhere. And still, the influence of Great Zimbabwe does not end with reduced activity. The story continues in what remains, and in how later generations understand, remember, and interpret the stones. Even when a place grows quieter, its influence continues, so we can turn to what remained and what was remembered. Now we come to the quiet after the movement, when the center has softened and the landscape has settled into a different rhythm. We remain with Great Zimbabwe, not to force one final explanation, but to reflect on what the stones still offer, through archaeology, scholarship, and careful listening. When a place grows quieter, its meaning does not disappear. It changes shape. The daily footsteps fade, but the traces remain, walls that still guide the eye, open spaces that still hold a sense of order, and a landscape that still remembers where people once gathered. Great Zimbabwe has been understood over time through a long process of study and restudy. Archaeology has been central to that process, because the most direct evidence is material: stone architecture, settlement traces, pottery, and the layered record beneath the surface. Scholars interpret these traces with care, comparing patterns across the region and testing ideas against what the ground can actually support. It is worth holding a calm truth about historical knowledge. Interpretations evolve. As methods improve, as excavations expand, and as new questions are asked, the story can be refined. Responsible history stays open to revision when new evidence appears, not because the past is unstable, but because our ways of reading the past become more precise. The lasting significance of Great Zimbabwe begins with the simplest fact: people here built in stone at a remarkable scale, and they did so with skill and planning. Stone building is not only about permanence. It is also about coordination, about knowledge shared across hands and seasons, and about a community's decision to invest labor in a place that it expects to endure. Beyond the walls, the legacy also lives in networks. Evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe belonged to a wider world of regional connections, routes of exchange and movement that linked different landscapes and different communities. Even if the exact shape of those networks is debated, the broader idea is steady: centers do not stand alone. They are made meaningful by relationships, by the flow of goods, skills, and mutual dependence. And then there is cultural memory, which can be quiet and long-lasting. Archaeology and scholarship help us speak carefully about what can be known, but they also remind us that places continue to matter to the people who live near them, learn about them, and carry their significance forward. The record is incomplete, and we must avoid claims that go beyond evidence, yet it is still fair to say that Great Zimbabwe endures as a marker of deep regional history and human capability. In this reflective moment, we return once more to the recurring motif. Wind moves across the ruins, steady and unhurried, like a breath passing over stone. The wind does not explain. It does not argue. It simply continues, reminding us that time has its own pace, and that history is often best approached with patience. If we let that patience guide us, the lesson becomes gentle. Great Zimbabwe does not teach us a single dramatic ending. It teaches us how societies can grow through ordinary choices, how stability can last through planning and routine, and how change can come quietly, through recentering rather than collapse. For a moment, stay with the rhythm of ordinary life, where daily choices slowly shape history. Even when a center shifts, life continues in other places, carried by the same practical needs: water, food, work, community, and meaning. The stones remain as a kind of outline, and scholarship helps us trace that outline without filling it with fantasies. So the legacy is not only the site itself. It is also the careful method by which we learn from it: archaeology, comparison, interpretation, and humility in the face of what cannot be fully recovered. In that calm discipline, the past becomes clearer, not louder. And now, with the long arc held gently in mind, we let the story come to rest, gently and without hurry. We return, quietly, from Great Zimbabwe to the present moment, keeping only the steady shape of what we have learned. We have followed a long arc, and we have kept it calm. A place grew into importance through ordinary choices and practical advantages. Daily life filled the spaces: fires, food, work, craft, and routine. Systems of coordination held the center together, and stability lasted for a long middle period. Then, slowly, pressures accumulated. Conditions shifted. Networks changed. The patterns of living began to move, little by little, toward other places. And the stones remained, while the center grew quieter, not in a single moment, but as a gradual change in use and attention. Through all of it, we have stayed close to how we know. We know through archaeology, through stones set in place, through layers in the ground, through the distribution of objects and traces, and through careful scholarship that compares patterns and tests ideas. The record is partial, and that incompleteness is normal in ancient history. It is one of the reasons the story must be told softly, with respect for what is uncertain. And now, we return once more to the quiet motif. Wind moving calmly over stone, unchanged by our attention. It passes over walls and open space. It carries no argument. It simply continues, steady and patient, like time itself. If you are feeling sleepy, you can let that wind be the final image. A calm landscape. A quiet ruin. A long human story, held lightly, without strain. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. And with that steady wind in mind, you can let the scene fade softly, and rest.